The distant echo of gunfire punctuated the evening air as Grace Rivers huddled behind the bar counter of the Painted Lady Saloon, clutching her shotgun with white knuckles and a racing heart. Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, 1878, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card, and where Grace had vowed never to lose herself to a man again. "You can come out now, Miss Rivers," called Sheriff Wilson from the doorway. "They've ridden off." Grace rose slowly, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, emerald eyes scanning the now quiet saloon. Glass littered the floor where bottles had shattered, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. "2 men dead, Miss Rivers," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "But your establishment's still standing." Grace nodded, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the damage. 4 years she'd owned the Painted Lady, bought with the money left to her after her father's passing. 4 years of building a life for herself, of independence hard-won in a land dominated by men. "I need a hired gun," she said finally, straightening her spine. "Someone who can keep order." Sheriff Wilson raised his eyebrows. "That's a dangerous proposition for a woman alone." Grace's jaw tightened. "I'm not alone, I have my business and my girls to protect," the sheriff sighed. "There's a man just rode in yesterday, Cooper Hayes. Former Texas Ranger, from what I hear, might be looking for work." Grace hesitated. Hiring a gunman meant bringing a man into her carefully constructed world, but tonight's violence had made it clear she needed protection. The territory was growing more lawless by the day. "Where can I find him?" she asked. "Been staying at the boarding house. Tall fellow, quiet." "Wears his gun low." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Be careful, Miss Rivers, men like Hayes have shadows that follow them." Grace nodded, already calculating what she could afford to pay. "Thank you, Sheriff." After he left, she began sweeping up the glass, her mind racing. She'd built walls around her heart after Thomas had left her at the altar 5 years ago, humiliated and heartbroken. Since then, she'd learned that independence was safer than love. Her saloon was respectable, no brothel services like some establishments, just cards, whiskey, and the occasional piano entertainment. But that made it a target for men who wanted more. Morning light streamed through the windows as Grace finished cleaning. Her barkeep, old Joe, arrived early to help ready the place for the day. "Heard there was trouble," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Nothing we can't handle," Grace replied, though they both knew better. "I'm going to hire some protection." Joe nodded approvingly. "About time. Place is getting too popular for its own good." Grace put on her shawl and headed for the boarding house, her boots clicking purposefully on the wooden sidewalk. Sweetwater was growing, with the railroad bringing new opportunities and new dangers. She'd built her life here piece by piece, and she wasn't about to lose it. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house proprietor, directed Grace to the back porch where Cooper Hayes sat cleaning his revolver, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning light. He looked up as she approached, his eyes the color of a summer storm. His face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw covered in stubble and a thin scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone. "Mr. Hayes," Grace said, maintaining a formal distance. He stood, and Grace had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the lean, powerful build of a man who lived in the saddle. "Miss Rivers," he replied, his voice deep and quiet. "I figured you'd come calling after last night's excitement. You were there. Watched from across the street, seemed like the type of trouble that would resolve itself without my interference." His eyes assessed her coolly. "But I reckon it won't be the last." Grace straightened her shoulders. "I need someone to keep the peace in my establishment." "Sheriff Wilson mentioned you might be looking for work." Cooper Hayes holstered his revolver with a fluid motion that spoke of long practice. "What's the pay?" "Room above the saloon, meals, and $30 a month." He considered for a moment. "Make it 40 and we have a deal." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but I have conditions. No drinking on the job, no starting fights, only finishing them, and you answer to me." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Yes, madam. You can start tonight. We open at 4. She turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Hayes. I run a clean establishment. No shooting unless absolutely necessary. Understood. He tipped his hat. I prefer not to kill men if I can help it. Something in his tone made Grace look at him more carefully. There was a weariness behind his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen too much violence. 4 o'clock, she repeated and walked away, feeling his gaze on her back. That evening, Cooper arrived promptly, dressed in a clean black shirt, his gun belt-worn and supple. Grace introduced him to her small staff. Old Joe the barkeep, Millie and Sarah who served drinks, and Tobias the piano player. Mr. Hayes will be handling security, Grace announced. Anyone causes trouble, you direct them to him. Cooper took up position near the door, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere of the saloon. Men glanced at him, noting the gun on his hip and the calm vigilance in his stance, and conversations lowered in volume. The evening passed without incident, and Grace found herself watching Cooper as she moved about the saloon. He was observant, his eyes constantly scanning the room, but he was also polite to the customers, tipping his hat to the ladies who occasionally came in with their husbands. At closing time, Grace counted the night's earnings while Cooper checked the locks on the doors and windows. Quiet night, she remarked. Word gets around fast when there's a new gun in town, Cooper replied. Won't always be this peaceful. Grace nodded, securing the money in the safe hidden beneath a floorboard in her office. Your room is upstairs, last door on the right. There's a washroom at the end of the hall. Thank you, he paused. You've built something good here, Miss Rivers. Grace looked up, surprised by the observation. It's taken work. Most worthwhile things do. He tipped his hat and headed upstairs, his spurs jingling softly. Over the next few weeks, Cooper's presence became a fixture at the Painted Lady. He handled minor disturbances with a firm hand and a few well-chosen words, rarely needing to draw his weapon. Grace found herself relaxing slightly, knowing he was watching over the place. One evening, a cattle buyer from Cheyenne had too much to drink and began harassing Sarah, grabbing her arm when she tried to move away. Before Grace could intervene, Cooper was there, his hand on the man's shoulder. The lady isn't interested, Cooper said quietly. The cattle buyer stood, swaying slightly. Mind your own business, gunman. The peace of this establishment is my business. Cooper's voice remained calm, but there was steel behind it. Now you can walk out that door under your own power, or I can help you along. Your choice. For a tense moment, Grace thought the man might try to draw on Cooper. Then he cursed, threw some coins on the table, and stumbled out. Later, after closing, Grace found Cooper on the back porch, smoking a cigarette. Thank you for handling that situation, she said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cool night air. Cooper nodded. Just doing what you pay me for. Grace leaned against the porch railing. Where did you learn to defuse a situation like that? Texas Rangers. He exhaled a stream of smoke. You learn to read men, to know when words will work and when they won't. And when did you leave the Rangers? Cooper was quiet for a moment. After Antelope Springs, 2 years ago. Grace had heard of the massacre at Antelope Springs, where a band of outlaws had murdered a family of settlers. The Rangers had tracked them down, and the ensuing gunfight had been brutal. You were there, he nodded, his eyes distant. I was the only Ranger who walked away. After that, I couldn't stomach it anymore, been drifting since. Grace studied his profile in the moonlight. There was pain there and a loneliness she recognized. I'm sorry. Cooper looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt something shift between them, a moment of understanding, of shared solitude. We all have our ghosts, Miss Rivers, he said softly. Call me Grace, she replied, surprising herself. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Grace, he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. Good night, Grace. She watched him disappear inside, her heart beating a little faster than usual. For the first time in years, Grace felt the walls around her heart tremble slightly. The following day, a letter arrived that shattered Grace's temporary peace. It was from Thomas, the man who had abandoned her years ago. He was coming to Sweetwater on business and hoped to see her. Grace read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking before crumpling it and throwing it into the fire. Cooper found her in the storeroom later, angrily counting bottles of whiskey. "Something wrong?" he asked, leaning against the door frame. Grace shook her head. "Nothing that concerns you." "Fair enough." He turned to leave. "Wait," Grace sighed. "I'm sorry. I received unwelcome news, that's all." Cooper waited, not pushing, just present. There was something about his stillness that made Grace want to confide in him. "A man I once knew is coming to town. We were engaged to be married. He left me at the altar." The words came out clipped, each one a small pain. Cooper's expression darkened. "Want me to run him out of town when he arrives?" The offer surprised a laugh out of Grace. "No, but thank you for the thought." "Offer stands," Cooper said, and there was something in his eyes that made Grace's breath catch. When Thomas arrived the following week, Grace was prepared. She wore her finest dress, her hair elegantly arranged, determined to show him she had prospered without him. Cooper stood at his usual post by the door, watching as Thomas entered the saloon. Thomas hadn't changed much, still handsome in a polished way, his clothes expensive. He approached Grace with an outstretched hand and a practiced smile. "Grace, you look wonderful," he said. "This place is quite impressive." Grace didn't take his hand. "What do you want, Thomas?" His smile faltered. "Can we speak privately?" For old time's sake, Grace hesitated, then nodded. "My office. 5 minutes." She was aware of Cooper's eyes following them as she led Thomas to her small office at the back of the saloon. "I've thought about you often," Thomas began once the door was closed. "I made a terrible mistake, Grace." "Which one?" Grace asked coldly. "Promising to marry me or leaving me humiliated in front of the entire town." Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "I was young and foolish. I thought I wanted adventure, not marriage, but I've settled down now. I'm opening a bank here in Sweetwater." He stepped closer. "We could start again, Grace." Grace felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. 5 years ago, these words would have meant everything to her. Now they rang hollow. "No, Thomas, we can't." His expression hardened. "Is it because of that gunman you've hired? I've heard rumors." "What I do and who I associate with is no longer your concern," Grace replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run." Thomas caught her arm as she turned to leave. "Grace, don't be hasty." The door opened and Cooper stood there, his expression dangerously calm. "Everything all right, Miss Rivers?" Thomas released her arm immediately. "We were just catching up on old times." "We're finished," Grace said firmly. "Goodbye, Thomas." After Thomas left, Cooper lingered in the doorway. "You handled that well." Grace smoothed her skirt, trying to calm her racing heart. "Did I? I feel like I'm shaking inside." "Doesn't show." Cooper's voice was gentle. "Some ghosts need facing down." Grace looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, of the warmth in his gray eyes. "Thank you for checking on me." "Always," he said simply, and the word carried a weight that made Grace's heart beat faster. That night, after the saloon closed, Grace couldn't sleep. She found herself on the back porch, staring up at the stars. Cooper joined her, offering his coat when he noticed her shiver. "Can I ask you something personal?" Grace said as he draped the coat around her shoulders. Cooper nodded. "Have you ever been in love?" He was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Once. Her name was Elizabeth. She died of fever before we could marry." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. "It was a long time ago." Cooper looked up at the stars. "After that, it seemed easier to keep moving, not to put down roots." "But you've stayed here," Grace observed, "for months now." Cooper's eyes met hers. "Yes, I have." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words. Grace took a step closer, close enough to feel the heat from his body. "Cooper," she said softly, his name a question. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Grace, the moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass from inside the saloon. They both turned, instantly alert. "Stay here," Cooper ordered, drawing his gun and slipping inside. Grace ignored the command, following him into the darkened saloon. A figure was bent over her office door, trying to force it open. "That's far enough," Cooper said, his voice deadly quiet. The intruder spun, firing wildly. Cooper shoved Grace behind him and returned fire. The intruder fell, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering to the floor. Sheriff Wilson arrived minutes later, summoned by the gunshots. "Looks like you caught yourself a thief," the sheriff said, examining the wounded man. "This is Ned Brewer. He's been robbing businesses up and down the territory." As the sheriff took Brewer away, Cooper turned to Grace, his eyes intense. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Thanks to you." Then, noticing the blood on his sleeve, she gasped. "You're wounded," Cooper glanced at his arm. "Just a graze." Grace insisted on treating it herself, leading him to her quarters behind the office. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers trembling slightly, Cooper watched her face. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice unsteady. "Occupational hazard," he replied with a slight smile. Grace looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Don't joke about it. I couldn't bear it if." She stopped, realizing what she was about to confess. Cooper's hand covered hers. "Grace," he said softly, "I'm not going anywhere." She met his gaze, all the emotions she'd been holding back rushing to the surface. "I swore I'd never trust a man with my heart again." "I know." His hand moved to cup her cheek. "I'm not asking you to trust all men, just me." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question. Grace answered by winding her arms around his neck, deepening the kiss. Years of loneliness and guarded emotions melted away as she surrendered to the feeling of being in his arms. Later, lying beside him in her bed, Grace traced the scars on his chest. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, but of this feeling. It makes me vulnerable." Cooper caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Strength isn't about never being vulnerable, Grace. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable with the right person." In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened. Cooper moved from the room above the saloon to Grace's quarters, and the town buzzed with gossip about the saloon owner and her hired gun. Grace found herself happier than she'd been in years, but a shadow of doubt still lingered. Cooper had been a drifter before coming to Sweetwater. What if the pull of the open road called to him again? Her fears seemed confirmed when a man arrived from Texas, asking for Cooper by name. The stranger was Marshall Dawson from Austin, and he wanted Cooper to return to the Rangers. "We need experienced men," Dawson told Cooper as they sat in the saloon. "The governor himself asked me to find you." Grace stood nearby, her heart pounding as she waited for Cooper's answer. Cooper glanced at her, then back to Dawson. "I appreciate the offer, Marshall, but my life is here now." After Dawson left, Grace confronted Cooper in their room. "You didn't have to turn him down because of me. If you want to go back," Cooper silenced her with a kiss. "Grace Rivers, when will you understand? I don't want to be anywhere but here with you." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Cooper whispered, "Marry me, Grace." Grace's heart seemed to stop. "What, marry me?" he repeated, propping himself up on one elbow to look at her. "I love you. I want to build a life with you." Tears filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the town church. The whole of Sweetwater turned out to see the independent saloon owner and the former Texas Ranger exchange vows. Even Sheriff Wilson looked misty-eyed as he congratulated them. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm. Cooper continued to provide security at the Painted Lady, but he also took on more responsibilities, helping Grace manage the business. They talked of expanding, perhaps adding rooms for travelers. Then one morning 3 months after their wedding, Grace woke feeling ill. After the 3rd consecutive day of nausea, she visited the town doctor. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes," Dr. Parker said with a smile. "You're going to have a baby." Grace sat frozen, her mind racing. A baby. Cooper's baby. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions: joy, fear, wonder. When she told Cooper that evening, his face transformed with such naked happiness that any doubts she had vanished. "A baby," he said in wonder, kneeling before her and placing his hand on her stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though his expression had already answered her question. Happier than I ever thought possible. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. Thank you, Grace, for trusting me with your heart. As her pregnancy progressed, Grace found herself embracing this new chapter of her life with increasing confidence. Cooper was attentive and protective, sometimes to the point of making her laugh. I can still work, Cooper, she insisted when he suggested she rest more. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my woman, not my baby, he replied stubbornly. At least take more breaks. Grace agreed to compromise, hiring additional help for the saloon. The business continued to thrive, and they began making plans for the future. One evening, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset, Cooper said, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to consider a change." Grace felt a moment of panic. What kind of change? Cooper squeezed her hand reassuringly. The saloon's doing well, but it's not the best place to raise a child. What if we sold it and bought that ranch that's for sale outside of town? A ranch? Grace was surprised. Do you know anything about ranching? Cooper smiled. I grew up on a ranch in Texas. And old Joe mentioned his nephews looking to buy a saloon of his own. It could work out perfectly. Grace considered the idea. She loved the Painted Lady, but Cooper was right, a saloon was no place for a child. And the thought of a home with land, away from the dusty streets of town, was appealing. Would we raise cattle? She asked. Cattle, horses, whatever you want. Cooper's eyes were alight with plans. We could build something that would be ours, something to pass on to our child. Grace felt a surge of love for this man who had broken through her defenses and given her a future brighter than she had ever imagined. Let's do it, she said, and was rewarded with a kiss that left her breathless. The sale of the Painted Lady and the purchase of the ranch happened quickly. By the time Grace was 6 months along, they had moved into the ranch house, a solid structure with 4 bedrooms and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Cooper hired men to help with the cattle, and Grace set about making the house a home. The baby's room became her special project. She sewed curtains and a quilt, while Cooper built a cradle from pine wood, his large hands surprisingly deft at the delicate work. What shall we name him? Cooper asked one evening as they sat on the porch, his hand resting on her rounded belly. Him? You're so sure it's a boy, Grace teased. Call it a feeling, Cooper smiled. A son to teach riding and roping, and if it's a girl, then I'll be wrapped around her little finger from the moment she arrives. Grace laughed. Either way, this child will be loved. When her time came, it was a cold, clear night in February. Cooper rode for the doctor, his face pale with worry, and returned with both Dr. Parker and the midwife. First babies often take their time, the midwife assured Cooper as she shooed him from the bedroom. Go make yourself useful elsewhere. The labor was long and difficult. Grace clung to the midwife's hand, drawing strength from the older woman's calm presence. When the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, tears of joy streamed down Grace's face. You have a daughter, the midwife announced, placing the tiny, red-faced infant in Grace's arms. When Cooper was allowed in, his eyes were suspiciously bright as he beheld his wife and daughter. She's perfect, he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with a finger that seemed enormous by comparison, just like her mother. They named her Elizabeth Catherine Hayes, after Cooper's lost love and Grace's mother. Little Eliza, as they called her, had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair. The ranch flourished under Cooper's management. They added to their herd, and their reputation for quality cattle grew. Grace kept the books and made their home a warm, welcoming haven. In town, they were respected as successful ranchers and devoted parents. 2 years after Eliza's birth, Grace found herself expecting again. This time, Cooper's prediction was correct. A son they named James Cooper Hayes arrived on a sunny morning in April. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought threatened their herds 1 year, and cattle rustlers another. But through it all, Cooper and Grace faced each obstacle together, their bond growing stronger with each passing season. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Cooper surprised Grace with a gold locket containing miniature portraits of their children. "I never thought I'd have this," Grace said as he fastened the chain around her neck. "A home, a family, a man I trust with my whole heart." Cooper drew her into his arms. "I was drifting without purpose until I found you, Grace. You gave me a reason to stop running, to build something lasting." They stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching Eliza and James play in the yard. The setting sun painted the vast Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, a fitting backdrop to the life they had created together. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Settling down with me instead of returning to the Rangers," Cooper laughed softly. "That's like asking if I regret choosing happiness over loneliness." He turned her to face him. "I've never regretted a single day with you, Grace Hayes, not one." As twilight deepened into night, they gathered their children and went inside, closing the door on the vast, wild landscape that had brought them together. In a territory where fortunes were won and lost daily, Grace and Cooper had found the greatest treasure of all, a love strong enough to overcome the past and build a future, one day at a time, in the heart of the American West.